This is the Gary Cantrell Podcast.
The Gary Cantrell Podcast for April 26th, 2020. How's it going? I'm doing pretty good. It's actually a rainy day in the DC area, and so that's not a lot of fun. But other than that, I'm doing pretty good. I'm just hanging out and doing a podcast. I like to pause when that little part comes in. Today on the podcast, I'm actually going to be talking about something a little bit different. I'm going to talk about starting your own podcast, because that's fun, right? Starting your own podcast. A lot of people have asked me over the years, how do you start a podcast? And actually, the funny part is that now I get this question more than ever because of the time that we're in, and everybody is got a lot of free time on their hands. So I figured, why not just do a quick little podcast to address this, and then we can go from there. And, you know, if it turns out maybe we could do more than one podcast, like go on certain subjects more specifically. But for this is kind of just like a, 300 feet up overhead view, of what it's like to start a podcast, the things you should be thinking of when starting a podcast, etc., etc. All right. So with that being said, just a very quick background about me in case this is like your first time listening to one of my podcasts. I have been podcasting now for the last 13 years. I just crossed over my 13-year anniversary, and I've been doing this particular podcast now for 3 years. It kind of started out as like a personal journal for me, and then I started doing interviews with people from Instagram back in 2017 and friends, and there's all kinds of various fun. And so that's kind of what the show's become. It's become more of like an interview show, but I'm starting to do more of the personal journal stuff on like the weekends, like this spot right here. It just so happens that there's not a lot going on with me this particular week. So I figured that we could allot this time for something else. So I've been doing podcasting now for 13 years, and I think that now more than ever is a great time to get in, because right now you've got a lot of tools at your disposal, and one of those tools is an app called Anchor. Anchor is an amazing app that I'm actually using myself, but it's definitely aimed towards pretty much anybody that wants to get started. It's aimed at anybody that wants to get started and just, go for it. So the thing I like about this app is that, as long as you have a phone, you can now have a podcast. I choose to use more advanced equipment, but, you could get farther along in your podcasting journey and decide that, you're really into it and you want all this extravagant equipment. But it's not required. The way to get in is actually very easy, and it's right through the Anchor app, because with the Anchor app, you can record your podcast. You can invite friends to be on a podcast with you. You can edit said podcast through this app, and you can distribute your podcast through this app. Anchor even gives you an opportunity to make money doing your podcast. Now, depending on how big or how small your audience is, obviously is going to determine what kind of money that you will make by doing said podcast. But I mean, hey, look, they're giving you everything in one spot. Not a bad place to be. Believe me, if I had these things at my disposal 13 years ago, there's no telling where I would be right now. So one of the things that you've got to keep in mind when you're starting a podcast is you want to have something to talk about, which is, I guess that's the obvious number one most important thing. You got to have something that you want to talk about. You got to have something that you are very passionate about, because if you're not passionate about it, you're not going to feel motivated. And if you're not motivated, you're not going to record a podcast. And the last thing you want to do is start a podcast, do 3 to 5 episodes, and just walk away. You don't want to do that. Don't do it. Now, don't get me wrong. Look, there is sometimes podcasting fatigue, and I am no stranger to this. If I had $1 for every time I thought to myself, I just want to quit, I mean, I could probably make a lot of money, because there are times where I get in my head and I think, God, is this thing all really worth it? I think the answer is yes, but that's because I'm passionate about what I do. But quite simply, you will have these times where you're going and going and going with the podcast, and you just feel like you just want to stop and you just want to quit. And I'm not going to tell you that those feelings are wrong, but I am going to tell you, you might want to reconsider if you really want to do this. You also might want to consider, what is the frequency of your podcast? Are you a weekly podcast? Are you a bi-weekly podcast? Are you a monthly podcast? I mean, you have options, but let your audience know what you're going to do with that. Don't just start up and then disappear. You don't want to do that. I err on the side of recording ahead, batching content, having evergreen content. And evergreen content simply means that it's timeless. You can do it, you can listen to it anytime, anywhere. It doesn't matter. It holds up the test of time. And what I like about, with my podcast in particular on the Wednesday weekly shows, is that content is pretty fairly evergreen, because I'm hearing a story from somebody else. They're sharing their story with me. Now that story doesn't change. Somebody could hear that story 2 years from now and say, wow, look what that person did. They lost all this weight and they did blah, 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 blah. Like, that's awesome. So that's evergreen content. I can record those in advance. I mean, right now, the podcast that I just put out this past week was recorded back in like February. So you have that option at your disposal to pre-record your episodes in advance. Now, if you are some sort of a show that relies on current events, well, then that's not going to happen. You can't really record so far in advance. That's one thing I learned about like the wrestling stuff. And one of the reasons why I've kind of set the expectation with people that listen to anything wrestling I do is that I pop in and I pop out. I let them know that I come in when I kind of feel, motivated and passionate to talk about it. And right now I'm not really feeling, I don't know that a lot of people are feeling very passionate about wrestling right now, because quite frankly, they're doing empty arena shows. And that's a whole wrestling centric topic. But the point is that I've kind of, after WrestleMania, I stopped doing podcast again, because I'm not really necessarily feeling it. Now, when bigger events pop up, I'll be right back into it. And my audience knows that. Now, I have to know as a creator that is going to limit my audience, because they can go and get, somebody else that's doing this on a weekly basis. And that's fine. The wrestling podcast is more of a hobby. This right here is kind of like my main thing, my main weekly thing. Every single week there's going to be a new podcast out. Almost every single weekend there's going to be a solo one with me, whether I'm sharing what's going on in my life, which is kind of more the personal journal podcast, or I'm going to do something else like this, where it's going to be like on a topic. And so you got to think about all these things when you're starting a podcast. I know it sounds like a lot, but we can just simplify it. You got to figure out how often you're going to put out your podcast. Number one, what are you going to talk about? Are you passionate about what you're talking about? Do you see yourself doing this on a consistent basis? Because if the answer is no, don't waste your time. You don't want to do that. If the answer is yes, well, then you should dive in and check it out, because look, podcasting is a lot of fun right now. There's a lot of podcasts out there. So the market for podcasts, is very crowded, but, podcasting, I think where it could be going, it's more of that personal journal where people can use it almost like social media, where it's like, okay, I have my Facebook or I have my Instagram. Oh, and I have my podcast, so you can hear my thoughts on whatever. And so you can use it for that. But again, you just got to figure out how often you're going to put out. And if you're going to put out, very sporadically, just understand that you may not get a lot of people listening to that. I mean, any podcast you start, unless you're somebody that's famous, like you're probably going to have 10 people listening, if that. And you got to get over that hurdle, because that's going to mess with your head, because you think, oh my God, podcasting is so popular. If I put out a podcast, just instantly I'm going to get hundreds, maybe thousands of downloads. And that is absolutely not the case. It takes forever to build up an audience to listen to your podcast. If you're not somebody famous, if you're not somebody with a big following, or if you're somebody, if you're somebody that's just popular amongst your friends, or you have a lot of friends, yes, you can get a lot of downloads. But if you're just the average Joe with a couple of friends and you have like a small social media footprint, like it's going to take a long time. And you got to be okay with that, because if you're somebody that's impatient, if you're somebody that's looking at the vanity metrics and you're a numbers whore and you're like, oh my God, I'm just, I want to get 50 million downloads, bro. Like, you're in the wrong damn business, because this takes a long time. It really does. You got to be patient, and you have to work very hard at this. And so if you can check all those boxes, if you say to yourself, okay, I am somebody who is patient. I have a subject that I feel very passionate about, and I know that I can commit to putting this out on a weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly basis, and I can do that every single time without fail, well, then you should go all in with it. You should dive right in, because this is a great place to be. Podcasting is a great place to be. I recommend it for a lot of people. So I think that you should check it out. I mean, that's pretty much the basics. Now, if you want to dive into equipment or, distribution and all that stuff, we can definitely do other podcasts, other videos, getting more specific. If that's something that you want to see, let me know. And we can definitely talk about that in future podcasts. If you have any questions, you can drop them in the comments below. I can address them in a future podcast or video, whatever you're looking for. I'm here to help, and I'm happy to help and share my 13 years knowledge of podcasting. I think it's a great thing to do if you're really into it, if you're really passionate. And that's pretty much it. So again, you want to be checking out the app called Anchor, and give it a look. It's free. That's the thing too. There's not a lot of investment involved in it. You download the app, you create an account, you start recording. I mean, it seems pretty simple to me. Check it out. See how it feels to you. Bring your friends on. Tell them to download the app, and they can contact you on there, and you guys can do a podcast together. If it fits for you, cool. If it doesn't, well, then no harm, no foul. You downloaded a free app, and at worst, you got some company emailing you or something, which you can always unsubscribe from. So give it a look. Check it out. Let me know in the comments below if you want to see more of this kind of stuff right here. I do have some other stuff planned. That's the other thing. I wanted to save this for the very end. I do have some other stuff planned, some other bonus type stuff now that we've all got so much time on our hands. These days I plan to put out a lot more, whether it's the podcast or the video. And that's going to do it for me for today. Thank you so much for checking it out. And by the way, if you are listening on the podcast, or even if you're watching this on YouTube or IGTV or Facebook, I'll put a link in the description of the video. But if you can go on the Apple Podcast and leave a review, that would be amazing. 5 stars is what we love. And tell people why they should check out the show. And that's going to do it for me for now. And I will talk to you again next time. See ya.